Welcome back to Upper S Clash Tech. Today we are going to assemble desktop PC. Connect components to the motherboard. Some people prefer to mount the motherboard in the case before they do anything else, but it's generally easier with most builds to connect key components like the CPU, M.2 storage and RAM without leaning over the side of the case. The CPU. Whether you're going with an Intel or AMD based build, the first step is to remove the plastic cover protecting the socket, then release the tension lever on the CPU and, with the most recent AMD and Intel platforms, lift up the metal retaining bracket, so you can drop the processor into the CPU socket. Don't force the processor into the socket or you'll almost certainly damage something. The cooler. Many processors come with coolers in the box. If you're not doing any heavy overclocking, those may be good enough, though lots of builders also like to buy more powerful, and often quieter, aftermarket coolers, which may also be more visually appealing. Stock coolers for Intel processors use push pins that go through holes in the motherboard. We recommend pushing opposite corners in to evenly spread the thermal paste and to keep from putting uneven pressure on one side of the CPU, just as you should do when screwing down any cooler. Memory. Installing RAM is a snap literally, whether your board uses newer DDR5 or older, cheaper DDR4. First, if you're installing 2 RAM sticks in a board that has 4 slots, check the motherboard manual to make sure you're installing your DIMMs in the right slots. If you put them in the wrong slots, you may not get the best performance possible, or one of the sticks may not be recognized by the motherboard or operating system. M.2 SSD. If you're using an M.2 SSD, now is as good a time as any to install it, because later on other parts may get in the way. You could also do this step earlier in the process, as an M.2 drive is small and lies flat against the board, so it won't get in the way of anything else. Once you've located the slot you want to use, you may also have to remove a heatsink/cover to actually get to the M.2 slot and install your drive. Some high-end boards will have a small plastic tab you can just push to the side when installing a drive, and then slide back to hold the drive down. Putting the motherboard in the case. Now that we've built the core platform, minus the graphics card, which we'll do later, we're going to install the CPU, RAM, and SSD-equipped motherboard into the case. If you haven't yet, remove the side panels on your chassis. Most cases have thumb screws holding their panels in place, which makes it easy to remove them. The I/O, input/output, shield, which covers the area around your rear ports, comes with your motherboard. You'll need to fit the shield into the chassis before you install the motherboard itself, making sure it's the right way up, so that your motherboard's external ports will fit through the holes once both are installed. You'll have to use some force to snap all 4 corners into place. Be careful of sharp edges, that's why you have the band-aids, as well as metal bits that can block the ports, especially if you have a budget motherboard. Note also that if you have a mid-range to high-end board made in the last few years, the I/O plate may come pre-attached to the motherboard, saving this step. Standoffs. First, gather the standoffs that came with your case, likely in their own bag, and find the proper place to install them. The holes in the board mounting area inside your case should be marked based on the size of the motherboard you chose. Many cases have standoffs pre-installed, so you may be able to skip this step. If standoffs are pre-installed in the wrong spot for your motherboard, you can use needle nose pliers to get them out and screw them into the correct holes for your board. Installing the motherboard. Now it's finally time to put the motherboard in your case. Make sure the holes on the motherboard line up with the standoffs you installed and that the ports line up with the cutouts on the I/O shield. Once the board is in, put the screws through the holes on the motherboard and into standoffs, then screw them down to anchor the motherboard in place. Once this is done, it's a good time to stand the case up, as much of the rest of the build process is easier in this orientation. Inserting the graphics card. Installing a graphics card is also an optional step. If you're using an Intel or AMD CPU with integrated graphics and don't plan on doing serious gaming, you may not need or want a discrete graphics card. But many AMD CPUs, as well as high-end Intel models, don't have onboard graphics and will require a graphics card in order to connect an output to your monitor. Connect the GPU into the PCIe X16 slot on the motherboard, it's the long one, and you'll want to use the topmost one if there's more than one on your motherboard. If necessary, plug the PCIe power connectors from the power supply into the card. You may not need to do this on lower-end cards. To install the GPU, you'll likely have to remove some slot covers on the back of the case so that the DisplayPort, HDMI, and any other graphics card ports show through, letting you connect your monitor later. It's a good idea to first try lining up your card in the case alongside its slot before installing it, if you want to save yourself the hassle of removing the wrong brackets and having to reinstall them later. Usually, the top expansion bracket will not have to be removed. That slot is a holdover from days when a PCIe X1 slot lived atop the first graphics card slot. But these days that area is now occupied by the primary M.2 connector, often hidden behind a heat spreader. Routing some cables through the back of the case during the build process is a good first step toward a clean build. But this is where you'll also shove any extra cable slack through the back panel, break out the zip ties to neaten things up and, then, put the side panels back on. You could spend hours making your cable routing as perfect as possible. But just spending 15 minutes making an effort to clean up your cables after your system boots for the first time can make a huge visual difference in how your final build looks. Whatever it is you like to do with your PC. And remember, whenever you're ready to add more features or performance, you can always upgrade. I hope you have enjoyed the video. Thanks for watching.